Hello and welcome to Mechanicum's podcast. This week's topic is architecture, my time and experience. The first section is going to be the very beginning and how it all started with me studying architecture. The beginning. So it was now 9 years ago. It was 2011. I finished my social service. At that time, it was still required in Germany to have to work at social service or go to the military for a few months. But after that, it was no longer mandatory, and people could just go where they wanted to go. But at that time, I still had to. I mean, I could have avoided it with a lot of paperwork, but I really didn't want to because I wanted to improve on my social skills, and working at a senior's pension, senior's home, I think that's how you call it in English, was the right thing to do, I think. So, basically, that was the start of architecture for me. At that time, I was a janitor in the social service, which was an interesting job, and I learned a lot of interesting new things, especially about work in the household and everything you could repair by yourself in the household. Small things like that. So, it all started when I finished my social service, and before finishing, I applied for many different studies because I really did not know what I wanted to do with my life. Something that's still kind of prevalent, but at least now I have a main goal to which I am working. And yes, some of the subjects I applied to were languages, English for example. I also applied to a study in art, in media science, and of course architecture. So after some time, some of the universities gave an answer, and most of the answers were no, we don't want to take you. And the answer from the University of Applied Science in Lübeck came, and they confirmed me. So they confirmed my appliance to the university, and I could start there at the fall of 2011. A few other studies also came back later, since I already applied to the University of Applied Science in Lübeck. I did not bother to rethink my decision. And why did I choose architecture? Because they took me in first. Very simple reasoning that had actually nothing to do with what I wanted to do. And yeah, after my application went through, I got a room commune. The first time that I moved out of my home. And this marks the very beginning of my study in architecture. And even though I was nervous, I, well, not eagerly, but also not reluctantly, started studying architecture in Lübeck, not feeling at home. This is the second part, and it will basically describe how I felt during all of the study of architecture and how it basically started at the very beginning, but it did not dawn on me that this was not the thing for me to do like 2 or 3 years later. At that point, I just wanted to finish the bachelor and change the subject radically and study something completely different. So, yes, I just did what was asked of me and studied. And there was, like I said, always something that did not feel right for me. But it was, at first it was unconsciously, because I was so overwhelmed with this new experience that I did not question anything about what I was actually doing with my life and if this was the right thing for me to do. It was more like, also because of the inexperience of my household, that I need to study to become something good that society can have some use of. So I didn't really feel like I was at home. But it was not just the university, it was also the community around the university. I was basically not feeling at home at the university or with the community. My fellow students had such different hobbies than I that I could not really connect with any of them. And the student life in Lübeck, at that time especially, was nothing I was particularly interested in. I just went studying. After that, I went home. Maybe I did some homework, and otherwise, I just chilled, played games, and watched some stuff. This was basically it. At that time, I was socially still very awkward, even after my social service, and even though I was in my early 20s, was still developing that. Was kind of a late bloomer in this regard, like in many regards. And yeah, did not make many friends in Lübeck. I made acquaintances, some of them, more or less, but I don't have contact with them anymore. I mean, maybe I should like ask some of them what they are doing, how they are doing. The answers would be very interesting indeed. Living in a commune was very strange for me because it was the first time I was living with other people and have to share responsibility for the home. And some of my roommates were really annoying in the taking responsibility of the home part, but they were pretty busy studying and they had a passion. I guess they had a passion for what they studied, so I wasn't very keen of complaining a lot to them. But honestly, I was the one keeping the bathroom, the kitchen clean, or at least cleaner. So yeah, that was pretty annoying. But it was a very interesting lesson, I think. Another positive was that the distance to the university was very short, and the student dormitory was just a few meters away from the lecture building. So I just needed a few minutes to get there, and it was very relaxing. So I could have a course at 8 a.m. and I could wake up at 7, eat some breakfast, and then just go there. No problem at all. So that was interesting. So basically, living on my own for the very first time was a strange experience, to say the least. But it was an experience. The actual studying of architecture. In this part, I will talk about how the studying itself went and how I felt about it. It's less complaining about everything and more like having an kind of objective view on how the process of studying architecture went down, at least for me. And the subject itself was very different from what I expected. I mean, I was not the only one who felt that way. And in my second study, it was all again the same thing. Because people are expecting something completely different than they get in the end. It was much less designing than construction, like actual construction in the sense that people can read your construction plans and follow it carefully to build an actual building. So not just plans about how the building should look, but actual construction plans about how the construction is to be made. That was something that I was never really good at. I wasn't really good at anything. Designing was also meh. So that did not work out very well for me. Also, that was interesting. That was very interesting because we had to do internship at construction companies. Something that I will never forget because some of the co-workers were pretty mean. I mean, they were working type kind of guys and they had like an affinity for their jobs, but it was not an affinity I shared. I mean, I would never go back to construction as a job because it was so difficult, annoying, and exhausting that I swore that I would never go back to such kind of work, at least not full time. Maybe if I had to earn some money, but never full time again. One of my favorite subjects was history of architecture. I remember it very vividly because it was one of the topics I actually liked very much, which developed into an affinity for history itself. Even though I do not study history right now, I still like it very much. And I also remember the term paper I made on this. It was one of the only term papers we had to make on the subject. in the architecture study. And there was a drama about how little the students used the actual library, which was very funny to me because at that time I was not very skilled at using the library. Yeah, it was just something I did not do. Just mainly used the internet for research, so that didn't work out so good. The funniest thing was just that the professor was so disappointed in how little the students, not just me, but all the students, use the library. That it's something that I remember like 7 years later, or even 8 years. 7 years should be right. No, 8 years actually. That's something I will also never forget. Another subject I will never forget is building physics. I did that exam 3 times, and only by the third time I actually made it. It was so difficult, and it was my favorite subject of all, math. And I hate math. I'm very bad at math, and I wasn't always, but by the time I got into my equivalent, the German equivalent of high school, it went downhill hard. So actually, it also went downhill at middle school. But before that, I was pretty okay at math. But in high school, it just crashed. Math was no more for me. Never again. And yeah, that was also a very difficult subject at the university. So yeah. And it also had one of the most epic exams I ever did, because it had so much preparation and you could basically take all of your materials with you, but it wouldn't do you any good because the actual tasks were so difficult that you needed to understand what you actually want to do. So with all the luck in the world, I managed it to finish it by the third time, which is something that has not happened to me in my current studies, which I'm eternally grateful for. Obviously, there was a lot of planning I had to do, designing, which I remember some of the tasks we had, but again, there was no real passion in the tasks. And I was more like, oh, I have to do this shit, and not like, this is very interesting. Let's try this and this and this. Like in my current study, this is more the feeling I have now, and not this kind of schooly feeling where you do a subject because you have to do it, not because you like to do it. That was pretty much the actual studying of architecture for me. When city planning came, it was more of a favorite of mine, and it is also the one I wrote a bachelor thesis about. But I obviously used a video game, City Skylines, and I used this to write my thesis about how a video game can be applied to actual architectural work, and it worked out well. My presentation was good, even though I had like a bad time, but this will be explained in more detail in the next section. And also I remember the inclusive architecture, like architecture for people with disability. That was very interesting and something that came back to me in my current studies. But yeah, it was an interesting subject, but it was not of the highest interest to me. And that's it with the actual studying of architecture. In the next part, I will explain further how my downfall came at the last 2 years of the study of architecture and how I visited a country I never thought I would visit. The downfall of my studies and how I visited Ukraine. Excluding my uneasiness I felt during the whole study, one key event was always very important to me and let me rethink my occupation back then completely. Being fired from my actual job. The second time I was fired from a job because I did something wrong. I got this job at the architecture bureau because the state would not finance me any longer, because I took actually longer than expected for my study. It takes 3 years to do the bachelor, but I needed 4 years. So after the second year, because I did not have enough credit points, the state would no longer support me financially, so I had to take a job, and I took a job at the place I had an internship in and stayed there for I think around a year. My boss was very nice and also my coworkers, but due to my incompetence in some areas, especially the drawing and calculating, I was fired in the end. So that was something that stopped me in my tracks, and I was rethinking everything about my current studies and if it is the right thing to me to do. I already knew I lacked the passion, and I had no motivation improving myself and my skills. So I knew that was the reason why I got fired from the job that I needed desperately. So I took two side jobs that were pretty inconsistent, but they got me through. And by the fourth year, the bachelor degree was close, but there was one little hurdle before that. It was in this last year I also realized that I had to do an excursion for 10 days at least for my bachelor's degree to be valid. And at that time, my only option was to go to Ukraine because I didn't have any money to go to more expensive places. So I chose Ukraine, and this was during the year of 2015. So one year after the Ukraine crisis. And I was basically very tense because it was the first time I went to a country so far away from home. But in the end, I did it, and it was a great experience and a very important decision in my life. The people I met in Ukraine became very close to me, actually closer than my fellow students, and with some of them I still keep contact. So some unexpected friendships arose from that, and it changed a bit of my outlook on life. Not completely, but a bit. Coming to the bachelor thesis again. Before I did that, I had a very bad breakup exactly before I had to present my bachelor's thesis. And the final presentation, I was so nervous and on the verge of a breakdown, but I still managed to do it. And my actual presentation was better than the work I did. But I had to print out something for my presentation, and my printouts was so bad. I just looked it up recently, and it was terrible. It's like one of the worst. It was the actual worst printout at the presentation in the building we have to put our works in. So yeah, that was a doozy. I will never forget that again. The whole experience, presentation and such. Yeah. My next bachelor's thesis will be better, definitely, even during these crazy times. And that was it. My bachelor thesis was the last time I would work at architecture proper. I tried to apply for a few jobs just to work, but it did not work out, and I went into a completely different direction. I got a job to make some money before continuing to make new plans, but that's a podcast for another time. My stand on architecture now. It's almost 5 years after I finished my study in architecture, and my feelings have not changed that much since then. I can still appreciate architecture and have an opinion on plans and drawings and design, but the passion never materialized, so I have never worked again on anything relating to architecture. But even after such a long time, I still remember some of the lessons very vividly, and I will probably never forget them just because of the impact they had on me. But again, another but, I have not used my skills, my now very, very rusty skills of architecture again after 2015. Yeah, that was 5 years ago. I mean, just recently I had to draw like a little plan, but that was for my current subject, just a means to an end. And it was interesting, but I had not my passion reawakened by this experience. I was like, okay, that is a bit fun, but it's not like, oh my god, my true passion has awoken right now. I have to change my subject again and return to architecture. Nothing like that happened. I'm just like, okay, that was fun. I don't need to do that tomorrow or in the next weeks. And yeah, pretty much it. I'm finished with architecture. At least as an occupation. As a hobby, meh. As something I can appreciate. I can always appreciate architecture and give my opinion on other people's work with the little expertise that I have left. But there is almost no way that I will ever work in architecture again. So basically, architecture remains as a little interest of me and nothing much more. So, and that's it for this podcast about my history of architecture. For the next podcast, I will be talking again about a nerdy subject, and that will be the other game that I currently play, which is Apex Legends on my PlayStation. And I think that podcast will be a bit shorter than this one, because I don't have such a vast history of playing Apex Legends compared to the study I had to do for architecture. But maybe someday I will have a sequel to my experiences with architecture when I can articulate myself even better than now. We'll see about that. But for next week, yeah, it will be Apex Legends. A very short podcast, I imagine, because this one is a lot longer than the last one. And it was very fun revisiting my experience in this field and talking about what I felt about the subject after such a long time. Yeah, I hope you liked it. I will see you on the next podcast. Yours truly, Mechanicum.